The Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida, keeps a doll in a glass case. The doll is approximately 40 inches tall. It is made of straw and cloth, dressed in a white sailor suit, and holds a small stuffed lion. Its face is faded and worn in the specific way of objects that have been handled extensively and then not handled at all for a long time. It has a name, Robert. Around the case and displayed on the walls nearby are thousands of letters. They have been arriving at the museum for decades, from visitors who came and then wrote afterward to apologize. The letters apologize for taking photographs without permission, for laughing, for treating the doll disrespectfully. They describe bad luck that followed the visit, car accidents, job losses, illnesses, relationship failures. They attribute these misfortunes to Robert's displeasure. The museum encourages this. The letters are a feature. Robert the doll is marketed as one of the most haunted objects in America. Ghost tours in Key West include him. Television programs about paranormal phenomena have filmed episodes about him. The Wikipedia article about him lists him under paranormal and haunted objects. None of the misfortunes in the letters have been verified as connected to the doll by any standard of evidence that would satisfy anyone not already committed to the conclusion. The doll is not haunted, but the man it belonged to was one of the strangest figures Key West ever produced. And his story, the real story, the documented story, the story the ghost tour version has almost completely replaced, is more interesting than anything the museum is selling. His name was Robert Eugene Otto. He kept this doll for his entire life. And the question worth asking is not why the doll is strange. It is why the man was. The Otto family and the house on Eaton Street. Key West, at the turn of the 20th century, was a specific and peculiar world, a remote island city at the southernmost point of the continental United States, connected to the mainland by sea and later by Henry Flagler's railroad, with a population of roughly 18,000 people, drawn from a mix of Bahamian, Cuban, and American backgrounds that made it culturally unlike anywhere else in Florida. The Otto family occupied a position near the top of this world. Thomas Otto was a physician, prominent and prosperous, whose family home at 534 Eaton Street, a large Victorian house known locally as the Artist House, was one of the notable residences of the city. He and his wife had several children, of whom Robert Eugene Otto, born in 1900, was among the youngest. The household employed domestic staff, as prosperous Key West families of the period did, drawn largely from the Bahamian community that had been part of the island's population for generations. Robert Eugene Otto, called Gene by his family to distinguish him from his father, who shared the first name Robert, received the doll sometime around 1904, when he was approximately 4 years old. The specific origin of the doll has been told in multiple versions, and the versions have accumulated supernatural embellishment over time. The most dramatic version involves a Bahamian servant practicing hoodoo who gave the doll as a curse on the Otto family. This version is undocumented, almost certainly false, and belongs to a tradition of American folklore that attributed malevolent supernatural agency to black domestic workers, a tradition with racist roots that should be identified as such. The documented reality is simpler and in some ways more interesting. A wealthy child received a large, unusual doll, became deeply attached to it, and maintained that attachment for the rest of his life. What that attachment looked like in practice is where the documented strangeness begins. The attachment. The behavior that local Key West residents and family accounts describe around Gene Otto's relationship with the doll is documented across multiple independent sources. Family recollections, local histories, accounts given to journalists and researchers over the decades, and consistent enough in its core elements to be treated as the factual record. Gene Otto named the doll Robert. This is not by itself unusual for a child. What is unusual is that he continued to call it Robert throughout his adult life and referred to himself by a different name, Gene, in a way that suggested he understood the doll as a distinct entity whose name took precedence over his own birth name. He spoke to the doll, not in the way a child speaks to a toy, performing a play scenario and then setting it aside, but in a sustained, ongoing way that he maintained through adolescence and into adulthood. Visitors to the Otto house in Gene's childhood reported hearing him conduct conversations from his room in two distinct voices, his own and another voice that he apparently produced for the doll's responses. When things went wrong in the house, objects broken, tasks not completed, accidents of the ordinary domestic kind, Gene attributed them to Robert. Not playfully, not as a child's excuse, but in a way that his parents found concerning enough to note, and that subsequent family accounts preserved as characteristic. He gave the doll a room, not a shelf or a corner of a room, but a room in the house that was understood to be Robert's room. Furnished, maintained, treated as the space of an occupant rather than the storage of an object. Eugene Otto left Key West to study art in New York and later in Paris. He became a painter of some regional reputation, a figure in the Key West arts community that would develop through the mid-20th century. He married a woman named Annette Parker in 1930. He brought Robert back to Key West with him. He gave the doll the turret room of the artist house, which he inherited after his parents' deaths, and he maintained it there for the rest of his life. The marriage and the doll. Annette Parker, Otto's experience of her marriage is not extensively documented, but what is documented is specific enough to be informative. She was a pianist, educated and cultured, who had met Gene during his time studying art. By the accounts of people who knew them, she found the doll disturbing, not in a supernatural sense, but in the sense of a woman who had married a man and discovered that the man's household included an object to which he was attached in ways that he was not able or willing to fully explain. She reportedly asked Gene to move the doll out of the turret room. He refused. The doll remained in the turret room for the duration of their marriage. Annette Otto died in 1972, 2 years before Gene. Eugene Otto died in 1974, at the age of 74, in the artist house, with the doll that had been his companion since he was 4 years old. What those 70 years of attachment constituted, what it meant to Gene, what need it served, what framework he understood it within, he did not explain to anyone in any surviving document. He left no memoir, no journal has surfaced. The letters and papers of Eugene Otto that are preserved in local historical collections do not, by the accounts of researchers who have examined them, address the doll directly in any analytical way. He kept it, he spoke to it, he gave it a room, he refused to remove it even at his wife's request. He died with it in his house. Whatever the attachment was, it was his entirely. He did not share its meaning with anyone who recorded what he said. What the attachment might mean. The temptation when encountering a case like Robert Eugene Otto's is to diagnose, to apply a clinical framework, to explain the attachment in terms of psychology or psychiatry, to convert the strangeness of what he did into the reassuring language of a categorized condition. This temptation should be resisted for 2 reasons. The first is evidential. The documentation of Otto's inner life is insufficient to support clinical analysis. We have behavioral descriptions, second-hand accounts, and the bare facts of what he did. We do not have his own account of his experience. Diagnosis from behavioral description alone, at a century's remove, by people who never met the subject, produces confident-sounding conclusions that are not epistemically justified. The second is more interesting. The behavior itself, examined without the diagnostic framework, tells a story about a human being that is more complex and more illuminating than any category applied to it from outside. Eugene Otto was a man who chose, over the course of a lifetime, to maintain a relationship with an object that he had been given as a child. He maintained this relationship through his education, his travels, his marriage, his career, and his old age. He maintained it against the wishes of his wife, and presumably against the social pressure of a world that considered this behavior strange. He was not confused about what the doll was. He was an educated man, trained as an artist, who had lived in New York and Paris. He was not isolated or intellectually limited in ways that might explain an inability to understand that a doll is a manufactured object. He understood what Robert was, and he kept him anyway. The question that the documented record raises, and does not answer, is what the keeping of Robert did for Eugene Otto that nothing else in his life provided. What the doll represented. What the relationship with it gave him that his marriage, his art, his friendships, and his community did not or could not supply. These are not questions that have answers in the surviving record. They are the questions that make Robert Eugene Otto genuinely interesting, Not the letters in the museum, not the ghost tour, not the misfortunes of photographing visitors. The man who kept the doll for 70 years is the mystery. After Gene, when Eugene Otto died in 1974, the artist house was sold. The family that purchased it found Robert in the turret room. What they made of him is recorded in the accounts that began circulating in Key West in the years that followed, accounts that described the doll moving, making sounds, being found in different positions than where it had been placed. The daughter of the new family, in the accounts that have been preserved and repeated, described Robert as malevolent. She said she heard him giggling. She said he moved. She said she was afraid of him. These accounts were given years after the events they describe by a person who was a child at the time, in a context already shaped by the accumulating folklore around the doll. They are not nothing. Childhood experiences are real, and a child placed in a house with a large, unusual human-like doll that had a room of its own and a history of being treated as an occupant might reasonably find it frightening. Fear does not require the supernatural to be genuine. The artist house was eventually sold again. Robert was donated to the Fort East Martello Museum in 1994, where he has been exhibited ever since. The museum's Robert is the tourist attraction. The gift shop sells Robert merchandise. The ghost tour industry of Key West, a significant economic sector in a city that has made atmospheric strangeness into a commercial product, has incorporated Robert into its standard narrative. The letters continue to arrive. None of them are addressed to Eugene Otto, the man behind the glass. Eugene Otto died with no explanation on record for the most distinctive fact of his life. He was a painter of local reputation, a product of Key West's particular cultural world, a man who had studied art in the great cities of the early 20th century and returned to the island he came from. He was a husband, a neighbor, a community figure in the specific small world way of a small city's notable families. He was also a man who kept a doll in a turret room and refused to move it for 70 years. The ghost tour version of his story has replaced him with the doll. Robert the haunted object is what Key West remembers. Eugene Otto, the strange, specific, unreadable human being, is mostly gone from the account, present only as the doll's former owner, the vector by which the object acquired its history. This is a kind of erasure that happens to people whose strangeness makes them useful as background and inconvenient as subjects. Eugene Otto's attachment to Robert tells us something about Eugene Otto that we cannot fully decode because he chose not to explain it. That choice, to maintain a relationship with an object across an entire lifetime, in the face of social pressure and marital conflict, without explanation or apology, is itself a statement about something. What that something was, he took with him. The doll is in a glass case. The man who kept it for 70 years is in a Key West cemetery. The museum has 17,000 letters. Not one of them asks who he was.